Welcome to In This Mad World. Get the history behind the headlines, a podcast from empireandeconomics.com. I'm your host, Andrew Gavin Marshall. Hello, and welcome to the third installment of my audio article series. And this is entitled When Monsters Make Empires, What is Fascist Imperialism? Part 3 of the series Monsters and Machines, the Political Language of Fascist Imperialism. To listen to parts 2 and 1, feel free to go back to the 2 prior podcast episodes. You can listen to those there, help you understand what we're about to cover in this part. So thanks for tuning in. This is part 3 of the series Monsters and Machines, the Political Language of Fascist Imperialism, part of my Little Book long essay series on empireandeconomics.com. Part 1 is called To Make Lies Sound Truthful, Orwell on Political Language, and Part 2 is The Monster Method, Defining Fascism. The one-sentence summary. Understanding what fascist imperialism is and what its consequences are, and then establishing both the United States and Israel as currently constituting fascist governments, according to our previously established definition of fascism. This article also includes several memes throughout, consisting of large block quotes of different scholars of fascism. So I'll be sure to include those in this read through, and will note when I'm reading a quote. In defining fascism in the previous section, we also established that it has a strong imperial component to it, at least in practice, if not in ideology, and that it currently flourishes in the context of a declining, and that it certainly flourishes in the context of a declining or collapsed empire. If we understand fascism as a distinct form of extreme nationalism and a method of politics, then we should make an effort to understand fascist imperialism as a distinct form of imperialism, and then we can understand how it is uniquely dangerous to the world. I will rely on what numerous scholars on the subject of fascism have said about its imperial components, and then try to weave together a broader understanding for the purpose of this essay. So here's a quote from Robert O. Paxton in The Anatomy of Fascism from 2004. Fascism may be defined as a form of political behavior marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline, humiliation, or victimhood, and by compensatory cults of unity, energy, and purity, in which a mass-based party of committed nationalist militants, working in uneasy but effective collaboration with traditional elites, abandons democratic liberties and pursues with redemptive violence and without ethical or legal restraints goals of internal cleansing and external expansion. I also highlight here the definition that we established in part 2. Fascism is a method of politics that emerges in weakened democracies and declining or collapsed empires, that attempts to build a mass base of support and utilize paramilitary violence to intimidate and gain access to power, which requires collaboration with established elites in a shared project to dismantle democracy and establish an authoritarian system of government, to return greatness to the nation, expand its borders, and build or rebuild a great empire, requiring militarism and imperialism, and which invokes as its primary ideology an extremist nationalism and mythical past, infused with an overriding sense of grievance, humiliation, and victimhood, for which the solution is to purify and cleanse the nation, to elevate its chosen community to a superior status, to purify, while dominating, excluding, expelling, imprisoning, or killing, to cleanse, or otherwise remove internal enemies, threats, or those unworthy of status in the nation, defined along racial, ethnic, religious, sexual, or gendered categories. In his book, How Fascism Works, Jason Stanley observes that empires in decline are particularly susceptible to fascist politics because of this sense of loss, which fuels a perceived sense of humiliation and victimhood. Stanley added that it is in the very nature of empire to create a hierarchy. Empires legitimize their colonial enterprises by a myth of their own exceptionalism. Empires are thus able to foster a comforting myth of superiority among the country's citizens, thereby concealing the various social and structural problems that otherwise would lead to political difficulties. When an empire declines, then, the citizens of a once powerful empire must confront the fact that their exceptionalism was a myth, which in turn fuels hierarchical sentiment as a mechanism to preserve the familiar and comforting illusion of supremacy. Declining or collapsed empires are therefore susceptible to fascist movements and politics due to the fact that empire instills a sense of hierarchy and superiority, while its decline provokes a sense of humiliation, grievance, and victimhood. The relative decline of a once great and powerful empire, therefore, can be perceived as a national humiliation. Imperial decline can thus fuel a dangerous nationalism which seeks to re-establish its perceived greatness and power. Here's a block quote from Jason Stanley in How Fascism Works. The most telling symptom of fascist politics is division. It aims to separate a population into an us and them. Giving a description of fascist politics involves describing the very specific way that fascist politics distinguishes us from them, appealing to ethnic, religious, or racial distinctions, and using this division to shape ideology and ultimately policy. Every mechanism of fascist politics works to create or solidify this distinction. Stanley G. Payne, in A History of Fascism, 1914 to 1945, noted that, quote, fascism was the most revolutionary form of nationalism in Europe to that point in history, which was strongly identified with military values, hierarchy, order, outward aggressiveness, and empire. Philip Morgan observed in his book, Fascism in Europe, 1919 to 1945, that the aims of fascist movements, quote, of forging internal national unity were often linked to and were premises for national territorial expansion and empire. Alexander J. de Grand, in Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, wrote that fascist regimes ultimately preferred, quote, expansion over stability in the final phase of their existence. And the renowned sociologist Michael Mann wrote in his book, Fascists, highly recommend, that, quote, fascists were motivated by a highly emotional struggle to cleanse their nation of enemies, and so they indulged in reckless aggression and terrible evil, adding that fascists were too aggressive for their own good, especially in their keenness for war. Fascist imperialism therefore embraced territorial expansion of the nation itself as a means to physically make the nation greater, as well as achieving the objective of building a greater empire beyond its own borders, establishing colonies and client states. The impulse to conquer and control and colonize made fascists predisposed to favor war as the means to achieve its aims. Their drive to cleanse the nations of those they deem to cleanse their nations of those they deem to be enemies or undesirables also extends to their newly conquered territories, except in the latter they operate in lands deprived of the laws and norms of their homeland nation. Instead, in the colonies and occupied territories of the fascist empire, whatever restraints fascists faced in their home country were let loose, and they engorged themselves on violent fantasies of cleansing and purifying through conquest. A quote from Philip Morgan. Fascist movements were radical hyper-nationalist cross-class movements with a distinctive militarist organization and activist political style. In a climate of perceived national danger and crisis, they sought the regeneration of their nations through the violent destruction of all political forms and forces which they held to be responsible for national disunity and divisiveness, and the creation of a new national order based on the moral or spiritual reformation of their peoples, a cultural revolution, achievable only through the total control of society. Their aims of forging internal national unity were often linked to and were premises for national territorial expansion and empire. In Anatomy of Fascism, published in 2004, Robert O. Paxton observed that, quote, expansionist war lies at the heart of radicalization, which he identified as the ultimate stage of fascism in which, quote, an obsessed minority is able to carry out its most passionate hatreds implacably and to the ultimate limit of human experience. Indeed, he noted, fanatical fascists prefer to destroy everything in a final paroxysm, a sudden final outburst, even their own country, rather than admit defeat. Paxton also observed that fascist regimes could not survive without the active acquisition of new territory for their race, and they deliberately chose aggressive war to achieve it. While acknowledging that war can radicalize all regimes, Paxton wrote that fascist radicalization was unique. The depth and force of the fascist impulse to unleash destructive violence, even to the point of self-destruction, sets it apart. Paxton noted that in the conquered territories of the Soviet Union, German Nazis were free to carry out their ultimate fantasies of racial cleansing. He added, extreme radicalization remains latent in all fascisms, but the circumstances of war, and particularly victorious wars of conquest, gave it the fullest means of expression. War radicalized the fascists, and fascists radicalized the war. War drove fascism forward, and war drove fascism to self-destruction. Within fascist imperialism, therefore, we identify one of fascism's many contradictions. That which propels it forward and gives it growth also accelerates its own destruction. Without war, fascism would likely atrophy into a conservative authoritarian system, deprived of its most extreme impulses, violence, and fantasies. With war and through war, fascism is able to more fully express its fascist character, to undertake its extreme programs of cleansing and purifying the nation, to grow its power and strike fear in its enemies, and then through these same processes of warfare, to unite many against you, to drive your own nation to exhaustion, destruction, and calamitous death. The war consumes the entire nation, its resources, its technology, its innovation, its objectives, its people. We have no example of a fully realized fascist regime because none has survived its own rapid expansion. Nazi Germany was the most fully realized fascist regime in history, but the very process which made this possible, the war, then made its collapse and complete destruction inevitable. While Nazi Germany lasted for a total of 12 years, the second half of it was consumed by World War II, which saw Nazi Germany expand its empire over almost all of Europe, and then collapse inwards and lead to the utter devastation and destruction of Germany itself. Paxton wrote that war provided fascism's clearest radicalizing impulse, and that once launched, war generated both the need for more extreme measures and popular acceptance of them. Paxton suggested that a general rule of fascism was that war is indispensable for the maintenance of fascist muscle tone, and also provided the occasion for its demise. In other words, war played a dual role in advancing and radicalizing fascism, while also hurtling it towards self-destruction and collapse. He wrote, both Hitler and Mussolini deliberately chose war as a necessary step in realizing the full potential of their regimes, using war to harden the internal society as well as to conquer vital space. As Hitler reportedly told his propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels, the war made possible for us in the solution of a whole series of problems that could never have been solved in normal times. While Hitler had no intention of starting a long, protracted war, let alone a world war, he probably did want a local, short, victorious war in Poland, or at least the public impression of having got his way by a show of force. It is worth reflecting on this point that fascism, and in this case Nazi Germany, didn't seek out a massive global war against Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, but rather that Hitler thought he could use bullying tactics and threats to acquire new territories, turn other countries into client states, and generally do whatever he wanted with little, if any, consequences. It was prior experience that fueled this belief, considering that Germany was able to annex Austria, then part of Czechoslovakia, then all of Czechoslovakia, and then moved on to Poland. Nazi Germany had forced its will over much of southeastern Europe and annexed two significant nations within 5 years of coming to power. Hitler and the Nazis were arrogant and full of the hubris of successful belligerents that they felt they could continue going as far as they wanted with little repercussions. Yet when Hitler went for Poland in September 1939, Great Britain and France declared war on Germany, and the Nazis then had to shift their attention from the East, which is where Hitler desired to establish the Greater German Empire, or Reich, and turn to wage war against its new enemies in the West, and thus World War II was underway. Fascism may not seek out a world war, but by practicing a form of international relations that triumphs the threat and use of force to pursue most, if not all, of its objectives, it provoked a massive global war in response to its repeated acts of aggression, the effects of which build up over time. Fascism's early successes in bullying others into submission and conquering new territories increases its sense of superiority and invincibility, which only drive it forward to make greater use of those tactics. But the shock, fear, and acquiescence of other states eventually generated resistance, which escalated into global war. Fascist imperialism is therefore a method of international relations in which threats, intimidation, and violent force largely replace diplomacy, seeking to acquire the most favorable trade terms, land, resources, subservient client states in the least amount of time. Fascist imperialism attempts to accomplish in a few years what established and past empires accomplished over the course of decades and centuries. This makes fascist regimes belligerent, brutish, and violent, ravaging their reputations as reliable allies or responsible managers of international order. Because fascists believe that international power extends from the threat or use of force, the only sense of credibility they can maintain is to follow up their threats with the actual use of force. As Paxton observed, quote, every fiber of the Nazi regime had been bent to the business of preparing Germany materially and psychologically for war, and not to use that force sooner or later would produce a potentially fatal loss of credibility. Fascist imperialism can therefore be understood as a concentrated, accelerated, and exceptionally violent form of empire building. Empires are typically most violent at their beginnings and their ends, when they are conquering new territories and establishing their imperium, and when they are desperately trying to hold on to their possessions in the face of decline or collapse. In between these periods, there is, theoretically, a period of stability or peace, a secure imperial order. The Romans called it the Roman peace, or Pax Romana, and the British the Pax Britannica. As historian Charles Mayer wrote, the Pax Romana, the Pax Britannica, and presumably the Pax Americana are purchased with the blood in the decades of their creation and their dismantling. On the frontiers, or geographic edges, of empire, there is a natural history of warfare and bloodshed, wrote Mayer. When they are being established and when they are being abandoned, frontiers become sites of endemic and brutal killing. Mayer added, whether the order they guarantee in the interim is worth the intervals of violence depends upon how long the period of stability lasts. Fascism, however, in expanding its borders, constantly moves the frontiers of empire and nation forward, forever inflaming violence and bloodshed. Fascist imperialism is therefore a constant expression of expansion through endemic and brutal killing. In the case of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, there really were no periods of peace in their empires, though certain areas of it may have experienced a calm interregnum of a few years between conquest and collapse, though more so in Western European states, which were largely governed by client states of the Nazi Empire, which was more focused on conquering, colonizing, and settling in the East. But for the Nazis to promise a 1,000-year Reich and deliver only a brief 12-year empire of conquest, control, and collapse over much of Europe shows how truly concentrated and rapid the process of fascist imperialism is, and how the very process that expands it also destroys it, like a firestorm consuming all in its wake. The greater the fire, the more it burns and the faster it dies out, for there is no more left to burn. Fascist imperialism enters the global scene like a burst of explosive energy, destroying all in its wake, including itself. One is reminded of the way the Roman historian Tacitus described the ways of war of ancient Rome, which both Hitler and Mussolini admired so much. Robbery, slaughter, and plunder they falsely name empire. They make a desert and they call it peace. This is the nature of fascist imperialism. But unlike ancient Rome, taking centuries to establish itself and many more centuries of rule and still further centuries of decline, fascism concentrates and accelerates the processes of conquest and collapse. I have here the larger quote from Tacitus, written in 98 AD. Robbers of the world, now that the earth is insufficient for all their devastating hands, they probe even the sea. If their enemy is rich, they are greedy. If he is poor, they thirst for dominion. Neither east nor west has satisfied them. Alone of mankind, they are equally covetous of poverty and wealth. Robbery, slaughter, and plunder they falsely name empire. They make a desert and they call it peace. In an attempt to understand the difference between empire and fascism, and thus be able to identify a distinct fascist imperialism, it might be useful to imagine them as individuals or groups of people. Empire, for example, is similar to organized crime, a mafia. It may have a top don, or the major power, but it requires a family of different figures, allies, to manage the syndicate and protect the system. While the system is itself criminal, immoral, and often violent, its violence is strategic and purposeful to support a member of the family in a turf war with another gang, to defeat a threat, to punish someone for not paying their dues and set an example, to establish credibility. But for a mafia family to be successful, they must also provide a general sense of stability and protection for their members and partners, allies and clients, to make deals and profit together, and protect the group from competition and outside interference. Violence is always a part of the system, but such syndicates are more violent in the process of establishing themselves and when they fall, when gang wars take place to replace rivals and seize new territory. Stability and profit are the objectives. Violence and intimidation are tools often used to maintain that system. But building strong and reliable partnerships with others, cooperation, collusion, and credibility in the eyes of your allies and adversaries is essential. Thus, empire fits quite nicely within the metaphor of an organized crime family. But if empire is a mafia, then fascism is a serial killer. While both the mob and a serial killer engage in criminal activities and violence, for the mafia, violence is a means to an end. For the serial killer, violence is an objective in and of itself. The mafia is business-minded, but the serial killer is driven by emotions and deranged fantasies that he wants to make real. Both may be sociopaths and liars, but the mobster has to be trustworthy enough to some to be a reliable business partner or source of protection. To the serial killer, lying and manipulation of everyone at all times is the standard. They have no friends or partners, and even if he teamed up with another serial killer, they would turn against each other soon enough. Often with traumatic and abusive childhoods, serial killers frequently seek to satisfy their sense of aggrieved victimhood and humiliation through domination of and horrifying acts against other people, usually targeting marginalized communities. The serial killer mythologizes and glorifies their acts of violence, and through it experiences an intoxicating power over others. For the mafia, brutality is a means to an end. For the serial killer, brutality is the point. The metaphor of empire as a mafia and fascism as a serial killer loses its strength when attempting to explain fascist imperialism, for it would imply an attempt to form a criminal syndicate of serial killers, not something that actually exists in the world. But perhaps it is a useful metaphor all the same, for it would represent a network of narcissistic psychopaths who would cause untold damage and chaos, kill excessively, turn on each other, and ultimately destroy their syndicate and themselves, along with anyone and everyone around them. Much like fascism itself, fascist imperialism is uniquely dangerous and destructive to the world and to the nations they claim to represent. As we have established, fascist imperialism is a method of international relations in which threats, intimidation, and violent force largely replace diplomacy, seeking to acquire the most in the least amount of time. Fascist imperialism is a concentrated, accelerated, and exceptionally violent form of empire building, which ultimately leads to major international war and complete self-destruction. It is, arguably, the most devastating and destructive form of imperialism. And while it is not the only form of war or imperialism that unleashes genocidal forces, it can and does unleash genocidal violence in the pursuit of its fascist objectives of cleansing and purifying the nation and its conquered territories. Another useful metaphor might be that of the life cycle of a star. A star is formed out of large clouds of gas and dust in the universe, which, when they collide and mix with each other, can generate a gravitational force that causes them to heat up and form a new star, a protostar. This would be akin to the various political, economic, and social forces that collide together and give growth to extreme nationalist and fascist movements. But the life cycle of a star depends on its size. The larger a star, the shorter the lifespan, because it requires more energy to conduct nuclear fusion in its core, and thus release more energy outward to prevent itself from collapsing under its own gravitational weight. In other words, a larger star requires more energy and thus depletes itself faster than other stars, like our sun. In this metaphor, fascist regimes can be understood as a supergiant star, seeking to build a great, large, and powerful nation and empire in a small amount of time. In the latter stages of the life cycle of a supergiant star, when it has used up all the elements it can fuse in its core to produce energy to sustain itself, the core collapses and the outer layers of the star explode outward in a supernova, while the core itself either turns into a small, dense neutron star or into a black hole. In the context of fascism, also typically in its latter stages, it expands and grows larger until it explodes and collapses, destroying itself and anything nearby in the process. Like a massive star, fascism attempts to fuse all the components of the nation to the goal of generating enough energy to expand outwards and avoid internal collapse. But as the star expands, it expels more and more energy, consuming more and more of the elements that it fuses together. The more it uses, the less it has, until it can no longer expel its energy outward and instead explodes into a supernova and potentially even collapses into a black hole. As fascism expands, it uses all the resources of the nation to expel its violent and imperial energy outwards, until all the nation is absorbed in this purpose, until the nation's resources and people are consumed to the cause of expansion. And then that which gave the fascist regime growth also results in its total destruction. Its supernova is the destruction it wreaks on all those around it, and the black hole is its total collapse into itself, destroying everything that came before it. Return of the Monsters, Fascism Back in Fashion. I attempted to address Orwell's concerns about the meaninglessness of words like fascism by attempting to define it in a meaningful and descriptive way. Now that we better understand the terms fascism and fascist imperialism from a historical perspective, we can bring them up to the present and understand them in the context of Israel and the United States. In the case of the United States, Donald Trump and his Make America Great Again MAGA movement represents a uniquely American brand of fascism. If we applied the definition of fascism that we established in part 2 of this essay to Trump and MAGA, we can see it fits quite comfortably within its parameters. Trump and MAGA have for a decade engaged in a political discourse of victimhood, humiliation, and retribution. Even the movement's moniker, Make America Great Again, implies some historic injustice done to the nation and community that must be rectified. The chosen community is quite clearly identified as a largely white male Christian America, and impure outsiders are identified as immigrants, particularly from Latin America, Muslims, Black people, Indigenous people, trans people, queer people, women. The MAGA movement is extremely nationalistic and view their community as constituting the nation, and all those outside of their community unworthy of membership or equal status in the nation. Thus, while claiming to be victims, they actively victimize and discriminate against others. While not a majority of America, the MAGA movement constitutes a significant base of support, and in elections can get enough of the rest of the population to vote in favor of the party and its leader to constitute a significant, though probably still not majority, portion of the public. Thus, it is a mass-based movement with popular support. It also embraces paramilitary violence in the form of militias, many of which helped storm the Capitol on January 6, 2021, in an attempt at insurrectionary violence to overturn the results of a democratic election that removed Donald Trump from power after his first term in office, during which time he was considered to have been largely restrained by the elites he had to rule with. In his second term, collaboration with elites is still essential, but with political elites more subservient, the collaboration is better represented among corporate and oligarchic elites, notably among the tech oligarch sector. Paramilitary violence in the second term is best reflected in the growth of ICE and other internal militarized police forces, many of which have recruited from the right-wing militias and have sought to round up and deport, quote, illegal immigrants and violently confront opposition protests. The MAGA movement and the elites it collaborates with are seeking to dismantle democracy by increasingly subverting the authority of the legislative and judicial branches of government, Congress and the courts, under executive presidential authority, while attacking civil liberties, free speech, the free press, and identifying political opposition and protesters as enemies and terrorists. And finally, while Trump may have appeared, or at least claimed to be opposed to imperialism during his first term, and while on the campaign trail, his second term is rabidly imperial, seeking to alter the existing global order, make new alliances, alter or abandon old ones, bully and threaten, remove leaders by force, threaten annexation of new territories with a stated desire to establish a hemispheric empire over the Americas, while also extending its violent imperial reach abroad. Thus, Trump's MAGA movement is fascist, and his government is fascist too. This does not mean, however, that America is a fascist dictatorship, at least not yet. For as we established at the start, fascism is a method of politics, not simply its destination. Therefore, you can have a fascist government without necessarily having a fascist dictatorship, though by definition, that government would be seeking to create an authoritarian system it could rule over. But this process requires time, collaboration with other elites, maintaining support from enough of the population to retain legitimacy, and to avoid provoking a backlash that removes it from power before consolidating its power. But this is also why fascist politics leads to fascist imperialism, because the process of empire building and war making helps to radicalize and consolidate power at home. Wars create security and defense risks that can serve as excuses to further dismantle civil and political rights and centralize power. Further, some radical bases of support for fascists at home can also provide the base of support for war and empire abroad, seeing it as an opportunity to realize their own radical ideas and experiments. In the case of Israel, we can identify a fascist movement within the far right of Israeli politics, and notably within the extremist elements of the Jewish settlers in the occupied West Bank. But to be even more specific, the best example of fascism in Israel would be the aptly named Jewish Power Party, or Otzma Yehudit, led by Itamar Ben-Gvir, and a notable mention to the Religious Zionism Party led by Bezalel Smotrich. But Ben-Gvir's party is explicitly a Jewish supremacist party, ultranationalist, racist, and seeking to create a pure Jewish society with the Arabs, Palestinians, either expelled or totally subservient without rights. Claims of victimhood, humiliation, and perceived injustices are rampant in Israeli political discourse and not confined merely to the fascists, though they exaggerate these claims even further. Ben-Gvir's party and movement are known to have facilitated the rise of an ultra-nationalist, religious, racist paramilitary army of youths in the occupied West Bank, known as the Hilltop Youth, who terrorize Palestinian communities. His party and movement also envision a greater Israel with expanded borders and an empire that they claim reflects its biblical destiny. Ben-Gvir and his party were invited into the coalition government under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the end of 2022, indicating a willing collaboration with conservative elites. Ben-Gvir was given the cabinet position of National Security Minister, giving him authority over the police and prisons, and has even been arming so-called civil defense groups all over the country, including radical settlers and supporters, as a kind of paramilitary army in waiting under his command. Additionally, all the parties of the governing coalition have been working together to try to undermine the independent power of the courts and thus undermine democracy. These efforts have continued throughout the course of the wars Israel has waged since 2023, and increasingly sought to stifle free speech, freedom of the press, and violently repress protests. In the Venn diagram of Israeli politics, there is a great deal of overlap between the parties of the far right, including Netanyahu's own establishment Likud party, when it comes to applying the definition of fascist politics. Certainly, there are several members of the Likud who could be classified as fascist, and even Netanyahu checks many of the boxes, though he is probably more of a political operator and opportunist than ideologue. But Ben-Gvir's Jewish Power Party is distinctly and unequivocally fascist. While Ben-Gvir's party is but one of several right-wing parties in the cabinet, considering that the government has essentially embraced the overall programs and politics of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, it would be fair to describe the Israeli government as one which is fascist. As we have seen from history, both Mussolini and Hitler had to rule in coalition governments with other parties and conservative elites. What is perhaps unique in the Israeli case is that the explicit fascist is not the one governing the coalition, though a case could be made for describing Netanyahu as a fascist, or at least someone who borrows heavily from fascist politics. In any case, the ideological leanings, actions, and objectives of the Netanyahu cabinet strongly support the argument that it is a fascist government, even if it has not yet dismantled democracy and established an authoritarian system of government, though not for lack of trying. Fascism should not be understood as a destination, but a process. The world has never witnessed a fully realized fascist society, one which achieved its objectives and created its pure nation and vast empire. The Nazi Empire was as close as it came, but it rose so rapidly and with such brutality and violence that it also created the conditions for its own rapid collapse. Nazi radicalism fueled its imperial expansion, which helped to consolidate power and pursue its goals at home. But its projects of internal cleansing, external expansion, and national rejuvenation were never fully realized, with Nazi Germany only lasting a total of 12 years. Mussolini's fascist Italy lasted much longer, but was more dependent upon cooperation with established elites than was Hitler. And so the radicalizing impulses were dampened rather than strengthened. And Mussolini's power was never fully consolidated, as is evidenced by the fact that he was removed from power by his own government. Thus, we have no pure example of a finished, fully realized fascist regime or society. As such, we cannot judge or understand fascism based purely upon its final product or ideal by what it aims to achieve and create. We are better served to understand fascism by what it does, how it seeks to achieve its objectives and establish its pure nation and expanded empire. Hence, fascism is better understood as a process as opposed to a destination. I make this point because it is important in terms of understanding how both the current US and Israeli governments engage in fascist politics and fascist imperialism, and therefore are fascist, even if they haven't yet established authoritarian dictatorships, created their pure communities, or defeated their enemies. As we cannot identify and assess fascism based purely upon its objectives, its desired end goal, so too can we not identify based purely upon our historical examples. We cannot expect to see Nazi Germany in the modern variants. Fascism does not make replicas, but it does recreate patterns. Because fascism is an extreme form of nationalism, it will always have characteristics that are unique to that nation and time. It would be wrong to assess fascism in the present day by the symbolism of fascism in the 1920s and 30s. There's no need for swastikas, Hugo Boss designed uniforms, Roman salutes, and well-organized Nazi rallies in order to determine if fascism is present. In the United States, there is the MAGA red hat, the blue suit and red tie, the jumbo screen Trump rallies. Fascism does not create replicas, but it reflects patterns and processes with distinct national characteristics. This also helps to understand why fascism in America and Israel take a more religious line than German fascism did. With Germany having a sizable split between the number of Protestants and Catholics, unlike fascist Italy, which was heavily Catholic, and fairly quickly aligned with the Vatican. Each country in which fascism emerges and enters power has its own distinct national and cultural flavor. That is why it is important not to be distracted by the symbols of fascism, its spectacle and pageantry, but to focus on its substance in patterns of behavior, in its methods for gaining and exercising power. Also important to note that historically speaking, fascists may have won short-term victories and even appeared invincible and all-powerful and fearsome, more so with Germany than Italy, but in the end, they lost the war in a devastating fashion, leading to the destruction of their own countries and decimation of large parts of the population. In this sense, we can perhaps understand the destination of fascism, not as its stated ideal of a pure and revived nation and community, but as its own ruin and collapse. The destination of fascism, therefore, is self-destruction. But its imperial characteristics spread the death and destruction to many other nations and peoples, and to the world as a whole. We draw historical parallels not to claim that modern Israel or Trump's America are the same as Nazi Germany, they aren't, but to identify patterns and processes that are in motion, and to understand the extreme consequences of this method of politics and form of imperialism. In the next part, we begin our examination of Israel through the lens of Orwell's concept of political language and the rise of fascist imperialism. Thank you very much for listening, and please like, share, comment, subscribe. Much appreciated. In This Mad World is a podcast from empireandeconomics.com, hosted by Andrew Gavin Marshall. Hey, that's me. Music by Francesco Caruso. Please like, share, and spread the word. Thanks for listening.